So now let's get into the actual processes that are going to allow us to capture this energy and harness it in the form of ATP. Let's start from the very beginning though, where we're capturing energy from the sun using the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is where we are taking light energy and transforming inorganic molecules into organic sugars or carbs. In fact, most of the mass of the planet comes directly from the air. We're capturing light from the sun and carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, let's look at the formula for photosynthesis. The input is sunlight along with water and carbon dioxide, sunlight coming from the sun, water coming from the ground through the roots, and carbon dioxide coming from the atmosphere through the leaves, and combining these together to form oxygen and sugar. Sugar is the primary thing that the plants are going to want. That's the food source that they're making for themselves. And oxygen is actually a waste product or a byproduct that they don't need, and so they just get rid of it. It's actually why there's a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere that we can use, because the plants are releasing it since they don't actually need it. So light energy goes in and chemical energy comes out. So we look at the process, right? Like I mentioned, water gets absorbed through the ground, through the roots and brought up the plant. The photoreactions are happening when we capture energy from the sun and we store it away. And then the synthesis reaction, we use that energy to build the sugar molecules, to build the carbohydrates. In order to get the carbon to build these sugars, the carbon dioxide is brought in from the air. And when we're done with our photoreaction, we can release oxygen into the atmosphere. And then these sugars can be used for lots of things, to produce different structures within the plants, to use as a fuel source for other reactions. The laundry list goes on. Photosynthesis doesn't just happen any old place. It actually happens in a very special organelle called the chloroplast. The chloroplast is this organelle that has special pigments that are going to help with the photosynthetic process. So photosynthesis is powered by light, and this light is packaged in little packets of energy that we call photons. And light is part of the electromagnetic spectrum, which is going to describe the energy of photons in the form of waves. Plants can only absorb certain wavelengths of light, mainly in the visible spectrum, which are the different colors that we see when we look around us. So let's look at that chloroplast. Like I said, this is a special area where the photosynthesis process is going to happen. It doesn't just happen any old place. So we look at it, we have the thylakoids, which are these stacked discs, and this is where the photoreactions can happen. This is where we take the light energy and we convert it into chemical energy. The stroma, or the fluid kind of around it, is where we actually build the sugars. Now, these photosystems, where the photoreactions happen inside the thylakoids, are packed tightly with chlorophyll, which is the main photosynthetic pigment. But before we get into those pigments, we need to understand color and how it ties in with light. So if we look at the electromagnetic spectrum, it's very, very wide and includes everything from radio waves to gamma rays and everything in between. Some of these you might already be familiar with, like UV or X-rays or infrared, as well as visible light. But in essence, what we're looking at is we're looking at the change in the wavelength in that particular band of light. Longer wavelengths have lower energy, shorter wavelengths have higher energy, with visible light being somewhere in the middle. So when we look at that visible light, we look at the different wavelengths that are going to give us the different colors that we see. So red being these longer wavelengths, and up to purple and violet being these shorter wavelengths that carry more energy. In order to capture the energy in these different wavelengths, we have to use pigments that are going to help absorb that energy. Pigments are just molecules that reflect color when lit with visible light. And so you see the color that is reflected and you don't see the colors that are absorbed. So if you see a pigment and it appears blue, that means that that pigment reflects blue light and absorbs all of the other light. So it absorbs the reds, the yellows, the oranges, and the greens and reflects the blue only. That's why it appears blue to us, because we can only see the light that gets reflected back to our eyes. We're not able to see any of the colors that get absorbed. This is why plants appear green, because when we look at the photosynthetic pigments like chlorophyll A, chlorophyll B, and the carotenoids, they're going to be reflecting the colors that plants appear to be. The chlorophylls, both A and B, are primarily green, with chlorophyll A being a little bit on the blue-green side. This is why plants primarily appear to be green, because these pigments, which are found in high quantities, reflect green light and absorb all the other colors. Like I'd mentioned, we're only able to see the colors that get reflected back to our eyes. The carotenoids reflect yellow-orange range, and that can combine with the blue-green and the green to give us that kind of more bright, almost yellowy green that we see in plants. It's also why when we look at the fall, we see that the colors change in the leaves and the trees before they fall to the ground. When that happens, when we start seeing less light available, the trees will actually reclaim a lot of these chlorophyll pigments. And so when they reclaim those and break them down, they leave behind the carotenoids and sometimes anthocyanins that look yellow, orange, and red. Since we've pulled away the pigments that reflect blues and greens, we're left with only the yellows, reds, and oranges that get reflected back. So like I'd mentioned, pigments are going to absorb all the colors except for the ones they reflect. And it's the color they reflect that's going to be the color that they appear. So let's look at the different wavelengths of light and what they absorb and what they reflect. So the higher the peak, the more absorption we're doing at that particular wavelength. The lower the peak, then we're doing more of a reflecting rather than an absorption. And so we see if we look at chlorophyll A, which has this darker kind of blue-green, we peak out in this kind of almost violet range, and we dip down from the blues into the greens before spiking up with absorption in the reds. So this is why we're blue-green, because our lowest points are in that blue-green range. Chlorophyll B spikes in the blue range, dips down into the green, and then spikes back up into the yellow and orange range. This is why that pigment would be on the more green side, because the lowest points of absorption are in the green range. And then when we look at the carotenoids, we spike in that blue and kind of almost green range before dipping down into the yellows and oranges and reds. This is why those carotenoids appear to be in the yellow, orange, red range, because their lowest point of absorption is in that range. So light from the sun is going to have all these different wavelengths together, but we're only going to absorb the blues and the reds and reflect more of the yellows and the greens, giving our leaves that green appearance. If we look at how much of each of these pigments are found within the leaves too, and this is just in general, we see that chlorophyll A is the most common, then chlorophyll B, and then the carotenoids. This makes sense because chlorophyll A is the primary pigment that's going to be absorbing that solar energy, absorbing the light from the sun. So having that in a high amount means you can absorb more solar energy at a faster rate. In the fall, though, we're going to be breaking down the chlorophylls A and B, and so we see that those numbers dramatically drop, whereas the carotenoids are left in a much higher amount. This is why, like I mentioned, we see that shift in color in the leaves. Since we don't have these pigments that are absorbing all the colors and reflecting green, we're not going to be reflecting green anymore. We're going to absorb that green and instead reflect only the oranges, giving us those beautiful, bright, warm fall colors for the leaves. So now that we've gone through photosynthesis and have at least a basic understanding what's happening there, let's get into how we can use those carbs, particularly for ourselves. Since we can't go through photosynthesis, we're not able to capture solar energy directly. Instead, we benefit indirectly by eating the plants and animals who've also eaten plants and capturing the energy from them. In order to do that, we're going to go through a process called cellular respiration, where we're going to take the chemical energy stored in organic molecules like carbohydrates and transform them to produce ATP. Now, both animals and plants do go through cellular respiration. It doesn't matter who you are. However, plants do this at a much lower rate Animals do this at a much higher rate. So let's look at the formula for cellular respiration. The input is oxygen and sugars, right? Oxygen that we breathe in and sugars that we get from the food we eat. And we break these down to form carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So if you're looking at cellular respiration and you think back to what we looked at with the basic formula for photosynthesis, they almost look like they're in reverse of each other. If you notice that trend, you're on to something, you're on to the right path. Now it's important to note that the nuances, the actual details of these reactions are very different from photosynthesis to cellular respiration, but the general concept is shared, and we want to make sure we notice that pattern. So chemical energy in this case goes in, and chemical energy comes out. So cellular respiration, we're taking in oxygen from the atmosphere, we're taking in sugar and other energy-rich molecules like lipids or proteins, and then we're going to take those, we're going to either store them away for later or we're going to break them down through a series of chemical reactions in order to produce ATP. Our waste products end up being carbon dioxide and water. So let's look at how these things are related. How do we tie in together and how do we benefit from the energy coming from the sun? Like I mentioned, photosynthesis is powered by sunlight. And so plants and any other photosynthetic organisms like cyanobacteria directly benefit from the light from the sun or the energy held within the sun. That's going to power photosynthesis. We take in carbon dioxide and water in order to also kind of push that pathway along, and we push out sugars and oxygen. The sugar and oxygen that is created from the process of photosynthesis can then be used by other plants and animals that eat those plants. So we can go ahead and eat those plants, or other animals will eat the plants, and then we eat those animals. The chain can get really long, but we're going to kind of keep it nice and short. So the animals that eat the plants can harvest the sugar and the oxygens from that photosynthetic process, harvesting the sugars from the plants that they're actually eating and harvesting the oxygen from the air that the plants have put the oxygen into. After that, we go through cellular respiration, we produce carbon dioxide and water as our waste products and ATP as our primary output. That carbon dioxide and water then cycles right back to photosynthesis. So you can see how while sunlight is the ultimate source, everything else, the carbon dioxide, the oxygen, the water, all cycles around from plants to animals and back to plants again. Now, when we look at cellular respiration, there's a few different ways we can go about this process of producing ATP. One of those is aerobic respiration. Think about aerobics, like aerobic activity, like a marathon. If this helps you remember it, awesome. So aerobic respiration is only going to happen when you have oxygen available. That's what makes it aerobic. So anytime you see the word aerobic, think oxygen. And we can get energy from 3 of the 4 types of macromolecules. We can use lipids and break them down. We can use carbohydrates and break those down, or we can use proteins. However, we really don't get much from nucleic acids. We can use these on some occasions, but primarily our macros are going to be the lipids, the carbohydrates, and the proteins. And we can use these to power aerobic respiration. So let's follow along the middle line here and talk about these steps. And I do think that you should know at least the basics of these steps, starting with the carbohydrates, and then we'll bring in the fats and proteins off to the side. We're going to start with the carbohydrates because simple sugars like glucose are the favored molecule when it comes to this energy creation or this ATP production process. So we start with a simple sugar like glucose, and we go through a step called glycolysis. Glycolysis meaning to split sugar. So sugar split. Glyco, sugar, lysis, split. So we start breaking these sugars down into smaller components and then produce what we call acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA can then, if in the presence of oxygen, can enter into what we call the citric acid cycle or the Krebs cycle. It's the same thing, just different names. The citric acid cycle is where we will then produce carbon dioxide as some waste, And this whole process of glycolysis, acetyl-CoA production, and citric acid cycle is mainly to harvest the electrons, which can then be passed to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain will then focus on using those electrons and the energy held within them to pump hydrogens onto one side of our mitochondria, allow those hydrogens to pass through the inner membrane, and drive the production of ATP via ATP synthase. So just to kind of slow it down just a little bit so that we're not totally lost in the sauce, we start with something like glucose. We split glucose in half. We then produce acetyl-CoA. That acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle. Through these 3 steps, we are harvesting electrons, and then we send those electrons to the electron transport chain. The electron transport chain is then going to pump hydrogens onto one side inside the mitochondria. Those hydrogens then will diffuse or move through ATP synthase to the inner membrane. And when they do that, we produce ATP. Now, carbohydrates is the favored source to go through this process, but we can also do that with fats by breaking down fats into the glycerol and the fatty acids, in which case they can enter at different steps, with glycerol entering at glycolysis and fatty acids entering at the acetyl-CoA step. And proteins, which can be kind of used at a variety of steps. Depending on the amino acids, we can break them down for glycolysis or enter all the way down into the citric acid cycle. Now, with the proteins we break down, we are left over with amino groups, and these are going to be waste products. So things like urea and uric acid will be the waste product from using things like proteins. But that's not the only way that we can go through and produce ATP. What we just discussed, you need oxygen in order for that to happen. But sometimes oxygen is not available, or not available in a high enough amount. If that's the case, we can go through anaerobic respiration, also known as fermentation. In animals, fermentation leads to the production of lactic acid. Now, lactic acid is not something that you want to have in your body. It's going to cause your muscles to fatigue and cramp and burn. But other organisms like yeast can do this all the time and produce things like ethanol in response. Ethanol is drinking alcohol. It's what makes up your wines, beers, and spirits. So let's go ahead and look at how that works. So if oxygen is present, we can go through cellular respiration as normal. Our final electron acceptor is oxygen. That's why it's needed. And our end product is water, as well as carbon dioxide. When we go to where we have no oxygen or not enough oxygen available, we go to fermentation. In animals like ourselves, our electron acceptor is pyruvate, but that produces lactic acid. Now, as animals, we cannot do that long term, and so we have to either get oxygen present or we have to stop doing whatever we're doing. However, if you are yeast, your electron acceptor is acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde, when it accepts those electrons, will end up with an end product called ethanol, or drinking alcohol. So overall, energy is a pretty interesting thing, and it's really cool to see the processes that living things can use in order to harvest that energy. Hopefully this chapter wasn't too crazy for you. Both the photosynthetic process and the cellular respiration processes can be kind of daunting. Definitely take some time looking at these processes and understanding the different steps involved, especially that one slide, if I go back to it, right here, so you can understand at least the basic steps of how we go from a carb to energy that we can use readily.